Chapter 1. The Whispering Mountains. The mountains of Calabria breathe like living creatures. At dawn they glow with the fire of the rising sun. At night they exhale shadows so deep that even the bravest shepherd hesitates before entering the woods. The Aspromont, that rugged backbone of southern Italy, holds secrets older than memory, and among its valleys lies a village that history has tried, and failed, to forget. San Luca. Just 3,500 souls, huddled in stone houses that seem carved directly from the mountain itself. To an outsider, it looks like nothing more than a sleepy hamlet, a forgotten on the map where time barely moves. But those who know, those who carry the weight of silence in their blood, will tell you that San Luca is not simply a village. It is a capital, not of a nation, but of a kingdom without borders. I was a child the first time I heard the name whispered like a prayer, or perhaps like a curse. Men in dark jackets leaned over cafe tables, their voices dropping low whenever they spoke of it. They would never say much, just enough to let the air grow heavy. San Luca, the Vatican of organized crime. The word stayed with me, like a ghost that follows your footsteps. At night, the streets are empty. Dogs bark at shadows no one can see. The old women close their shutters before dusk, and the younger men disappear into farmhouses, barns, or nowhere at all. The silence is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of 1,000 unspoken rules. Here, silence is law. Here, family is everything. They say the story begins in chaos, when kingdoms fell and a new Italy rose from the ashes. But the soil of Calabria remembers more than dates or crowns. It remembers blood. It remembers betrayal. It remembers the men who shaped their own law when no law would protect them. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the mountains whisper their names. Pell, Romeo, Vatari, Nerta. Families that would weave their bloodlines together into something far stronger than iron, far more lasting than any government decree. For generations they have ruled from the shadows, transforming a forgotten village into the beating heart of an empire that stretches from Melbourne to Toronto, from Duisburg to Buenos Aires. But to understand them, you must first understand the land. Calabria is not generous. Its soil is rocky, its summers cruel, its winters long. The sea glitters on both sides, mocking the peasants who cannot escape. For centuries, the people here were abandoned by kings, by governments, by anyone who promised help. The state promised justice and gave them nothing. And so the people learned to find justice elsewhere. They built their own system, ruthless, yes, but dependable. A system of order where chaos ruled, of loyalty where betrayal was certain, of silence where words could kill. I tell you this not from books, but from memories. I am old now, my arms covered in faded tattoos that map the choices of my youth. I sit here with you tonight because someone must tell the story. Not the one in newspapers, not the one written by frightened reporters in Rome, but the real story, the one whispered around firesides and carved into the soul of these mountains. It is not a story of heroes. It is not even a story of villains. It is the story of survival, of men and women who built an empire in the shadows because the light of the state never reached them. So listen closely. The wind in the Aspromont carries voices you cannot see. Some belong to shepherds long dead, others to bosses who ruled the world from behind farmhouse doors. If you are quiet enough, you will hear the echo of secret meetings held under the shadow of a 1,000-year-old sanctuary. You will hear the laughter of weddings that were not celebrations but alliances, and the gunshots of feuds that began with a childish prank and ended in international bloodbaths. And all of it, every bullet, every oath, every betrayal, leads back here to San Luca. This is where it began. This is where it still begins. Chapter 2. Flames After the Kingdom. March 17, 1861. A new kingdom is proclaimed. Bells ring in Turin, flags unfurl in Florence, and politicians toast in marble halls, believing they have forged a nation from fragments. But while the North celebrates, the South burns. Calabria, wild, raw, abandoned, did not cheer with the others. In the villages that cling to the slopes of Aspromont, the proclamation of Italy meant nothing but another master with a different accent. The old rulers had collapsed, and the new rulers arrived with soldiers and taxes, but not with mercy. I remember my grandfather's words, passed down like an inheritance. We changed the flag, but the hunger stayed the same. The fields lay barren, drained by centuries of neglect. Families starved while officials in crisp uniforms demanded impossible levies. The promises of the new state, justice, prosperity, order, never crossed the mountains. Instead, the South became a colony, squeezed until it bled. And when people are pushed too far, they take up arms. In the hills, brigands rose. Peasants, deserters, men with nothing left to lose. They fought in the open, ambushing Savoy troops, burning outposts, robbing the rich. They were fierce, desperate, sometimes noble, sometimes savage. Their cause was justice, or vengeance, or perhaps just survival. They carried muskets, rusty swords, and the fury of a people abandoned. Imagine the scene, a farmhouse at dusk, flames licking the horizon. Women clutch their children as riders thunder past, muskets slung across their backs. Shots echo in the distance. Somewhere, a tax collector hangs from a tree. To the new state, it is rebellion. To the villagers, it is the sound of dignity clawing its way back. But listen closely. Behind the chaos of brigandage, something quieter is happening. Something colder, more calculating. While brigands fight and die in the forests, small groups of men in the villages begin to meet in secret. They do not waste bullets in open war. They gather in candlelit rooms, in barns, in vineyards after dark. They speak of rules, of loyalty, of brotherhood stronger than any law. These are not mere bandits. They are builders. They study the codes of the old Carbonari, the secret societies that once plotted revolutions. They adapt their rituals, their signs, their oaths. In one such meeting, a boy of 16 kneels before 3 men. A candle flickers, casting long shadows on the stone walls. A holy card burns in his hands, the ash falling onto the dirt floor. He repeats the words he has been taught, to be loyal, to be silent, to carry the weight of blood. He is not joining a band of brigands. He is joining something destined to outlive empires. By the end of the 1860s, the brigands are gone. Crushed, hunted, executed, forgotten. Their bodies rot in shallow graves, their names erased from history books. But the brotherhood remains. Stronger, deeper, invisible. The first police reports appear, scribbled notes by carabinieri who cannot quite grasp what they are seeing. Associations of criminals, not isolated thieves, bound by strict codes. They do not yet have a name for it. But we do. The brigands burned bright and were extinguished. The 'Ndrangheta lit a colder fire, one that still smolders to this day. Chapter 3. The Birth of a Secret Brotherhood. Night in Aspermont is like no other. The forest thickens until the stars vanish. Owls watch silently from twisted branches, and the wind carries the scent of pine, smoke, and fear. In these nights, men gathered not as rebels, not as brigands, but as architects of something far more enduring. They called themselves nothing at first. Just the men. Farmers, shepherds, smugglers, stonemasons. Ordinary lives by day. But when the shutters closed and the lamps went out, they became something else. They became brothers. It began with imitation. The Carbonari, secret societies born to overthrow tyrants, had left behind rituals. Arcane gestures, whispered passwords, symbolic flames. The young Calabrians studied these fragments, reshaped them, stripped away the politics, and forged a code of their own. Not rebellion. Not justice. Power. Picture the scene, a ruined farmhouse in the hills, its stones blackened by old fires. Inside, 12 men form a circle around a single candle. In the center kneels a recruit, his hands trembling. A holy card is pressed into his palm. He is told to set it alight, to let the flames lick his skin until the ashes fall into a bowl of wine. He drinks, swallowing not just ashes but a vow. A voice intones. From this night forward, your tongue belongs to silence. Your blood belongs to us. Your life belongs to the brotherhood. The boy nods, his lips dry, his eyes wide. The fire has burned his fingers, but he does not flinch. If he did, he would be cast out, disgraced forever. Above them, thunder rolls. The Aspermont seems to approve. Each rank had its meaning, its guardian saint, its secret phrase. A boy became Picciotto, an honored foot soldier. With loyalty, he might one day rise to Scarista, entrusted with more than just muscle. But the higher mysteries, the Santa, the Vangelo, the sacred codes, remained hidden, guarded by the elders of San Luca. These were not empty titles. They were stages of a transformation, from man to shadow, from criminal to disciple of a dark faith. A Carabinieri report from 1872, still preserved in dusty archives, describes them as bound together by secret discipline, committing crimes with military precision. The officers did not yet realize they were witnessing the birth of a dynasty, not a gang. It was here that crime became liturgy, betrayal became heresy, violence became sacrament. And while the rest of Italy celebrated unity, Calabria was quietly consecrating a new church, one without walls, without priests, but with its own gospel of blood. The brotherhood did not die in battles like the brigands. It thrived in silence. It spread not by banners and speeches, but by oaths whispered in the dark. Each new recruit became a link in a chain that could not be broken, because it was forged in family, in ritual, in fear, and in faith twisted into something unrecognizable. The Ndrangheta was not born in a day. It was born in fire, in silence, in the ashes of saints and the blood of oaths. And though the world did not yet know its name, the mountain already whispered it. San Luca would be its cradle. Chapter 4: San Luca, the silent capital. San Luca does not look like a capital. It clings to the side of the Aspromonte Mountains like a stubborn weed, a cluster of stone houses stacked one upon another, their walls cracked by centuries of storms. Laundry flutters on lines stretched between balconies, goats wander the alleys, and the church bells ring not for celebration but as a reminder that time still moves here, slowly, reluctantly. 3,000 souls, maybe fewer. A handful of shops, a bar or two where old men drink thick coffee in silence, their eyes never meeting yours for long. Stray dogs doze in the sun, but when night falls even they retreat into corners, as if the darkness belongs to someone else. To a stranger, San Luca is poverty. But to those who know, it is power. From this village, forgotten by Rome, ignored by kings, left to the mercy of hunger, sprang families that would shape the destiny of continents. Pell, Nerta, Romeo, Vatari. Names as ordinary as the stones beneath your feet, but here they are more than names. They are dynasties. Each family traces its blood back generations, to ancestors who survived famine, war, and betrayal. They intermarry, weaving a web so tight that to attack one is to declare war on them all. They fight, yes, but even their feuds are bound by rules older than the state itself. The heart of San Luca beats in silence. No orders are shouted in the streets. No banners are raised. Power here is not displayed. It is felt. A newcomer senses it at once, the way you feel the weight of a storm before it breaks. Conversations stop when you pass. Windows close. Eyes follow you. The sanctuary of Polsi watches from above, a 1,000-year-old monastery hidden in the folds of the mountains. To outsiders, it is a holy site. To San Luca, it is something else. The place where the clans gather, once a year, under the cover of pilgrimage. The Virgin's feast is the mask. Behind it, deals are struck, disputes settled, territories divided. I remember my first visit as a boy. The village seemed asleep under the afternoon sun. Women sat outside their doors, shelling beans, their hands never pausing even when strangers passed. Children played with sticks in the dust. Nothing moved quickly. Nothing seemed threatening. But then, just for a moment, I caught sight of them. 3 men standing in the shade of a fig tree, speaking without words. A tilt of the head. A gesture of the hand. They didn't need more. In that silence, decisions were made that would echo across oceans. San Luca is not a capital built of marble or steel. It has no monuments, no parades, no grand avenues. Its power is not visible. It is buried in bloodlines, in rituals, in silence. Yet from these narrow streets radiates an empire. From here, orders travel in whispers and end in gunfire thousands of kilometers away. To live in San Luca is to know that everything is watched, everything is remembered, and nothing is forgiven. The world sees a village. The initiated see a throne. Chapter 5. The Sanctuary of Polsi. High in the folds of Aspermont, where clouds cling to the peaks and the air tastes of stone and pine, stands the sanctuary of Our Lady of Polsi. To the faithful, it is a holy place. 1,000 years of prayer have soaked into its walls. Pilgrims come barefoot, carrying candles and crosses, climbing the rough mountain paths with songs on their lips and blisters on their feet. The Virgin is their hope, their comfort, their salvation. But there are other pilgrims who walk the same paths with different intentions. Men in dark suits, their faces weathered by sun and secrecy. They arrive not to pray, but to rule. Each September, during the Feast of the Madonna, the sanctuary transforms. By day, hymns rise into the mountain air, mingling with the bleating of goats and the chatter of vendors selling bread and olives. Families camp in the meadows, fires crackling, children chasing each other through the grass. It looks like a festival, a holy celebration. Yet beneath this layer of devotion lies another gathering, hidden but not invisible. In the shadows of the monastery walls, far from the crowds, the leaders of Calabria meet. Pell, Nerta, Romeo, Vatari. Names that carry the weight of centuries. They come not with weapons drawn, but with nods, handshakes, and the silence of men who do not need words to be understood. I remember standing on the edge of the crowd once, still a boy, when my uncle whispered in my ear, "Watch carefully. This is not just a feast. This is Parliament." At Polsi, disputes are settled before they ignite into war. Territories are divided like bread at a table. Blood debts are confirmed, alliances renewed, betrayals punished. And all of it happens under the gaze of the Madonna, as if heaven itself were a silent witness. The rituals mirror religion. A brother kneels, a candle flickers, an oath is sworn. But the words are twisted, sanctifying not mercy but loyalty, not forgiveness but vengeance. The Virgin watches from her altar as men consecrate an empire of silence and blood. Imagine the scene. Inside the church, pilgrims chant Ave Maria, their voices trembling with faith. Outside, in the cloistered shadows, a boss leans close to another, his whisper deciding the fate of men thousands of kilometers away. In Genoa, in Toronto, in Melbourne, in New York. Polsi is the axis of two worlds. For the people, it is heaven's doorway. For the brotherhood, it is the beating heart of their dominion. No document records these meetings. No photograph dares capture them. Yet everyone in San Luca knows. Without Polsi, there is no Ndrangheta. And so, year after year, as the candles burn and the hymns rise, the brotherhood renews itself. Hidden in plain sight, beneath the mantle of the Virgin, they remind the world, and themselves, that their power is eternal, because it is sanctified not only by blood but by the illusion of holiness. Polsi is not just a sanctuary. It is a throne room. Chapter 6, Blood Feuds and the Law of Silence. They call it Fida. To outsiders, it means feud. But here, in the valleys of Aspermont, Fida is not a quarrel, it is a destiny. It begins with a spark, an insult at a wedding, a debt unpaid, a jealous glance in a bar. But in San Luca, in Plati, in Africa, that spark falls on dry timber soaked with generations of grudges. One shot fired in the night, and suddenly two families are bound to a war that may last decades. A feud here does not end with the guilty. It spreads like fire, touching cousins, in-laws, even friends who chose the wrong side. A man is killed, and his brother must answer. That brother falls, and his son grows up with one lesson written in his blood. Revenge is an inheritance. I remember hearing of one feud that began with a game of cards. A knife flashed, a man bled out on the dirt floor of a tavern. 30 years later, the graves were still being dug, sons killing sons, grandsons ambushing grandsons on mountain roads. The law tried to intervene, but what law could reach into the silence of these hills? Judges, policemen, soldiers, all were strangers, and strangers could not be trusted. Here, justice was not blind. It was personal, carved into flesh and memory. And above all, there was omerta, the law of silence. To speak was to betray. To betray was to die. Even women, even children knew it. A mother might cradle her son's body in the street, but when the carabinieri came asking questions, she would shake her head. "I saw nothing," she would whisper. "I know nothing." A boy of 10 could tell you the caliber of a pistol by the sound it made, yet he would never tell you who pulled the trigger. Silence was thicker than blood, harder than stone. In time, silence itself became the strongest weapon. Because silence is not just the refusal to speak, it is a wall. It makes crimes vanish. It makes killers invisible. It turns villages into fortresses where truth cannot enter. And so, feud after feud, silence held. San Luca's streets ran red more than once, but never with words. The world beyond Calabria could not understand it. Newspapers called it barbarism. Politicians spoke of backwardness. They did not see the truth, that these feuds, this silence, this blood, it was not chaos. It was order. A dark order, older than the Italian state, carved into the soul of every man who called this land his own. Fida was not just vengeance. It was history repeating itself, a wheel that never stopped turning. And Omerta was the grease that kept it spinning, generation after generation. If you asked me what sound defined my youth, it was not the laughter of festivals, not the bells of the church, not even the songs of shepherds echoing through the mountains. No, the sound was silence. Heavy, absolute. A silence so deep it could bury the truth forever. Chapter 7. The First Expansion. Hunger is a merciless teacher. By the mid-20th century, Calabria's villages were suffocating. Fields could no longer feed their people, and the mountains offered only stones and silence. Young men looked north, toward the cities of Milan and Turin, where factories smoked and wages, though small, meant survival. But the Brotherhood did not travel north merely to work. They carried something with them: their silence, their loyalties, their law. And wherever they went, they planted those roots in new soil. At first it was small things. A shipment of contraband cigarettes smuggled across the coast at night. A truck loaded with stolen goods that vanished on a highway and reappeared in a market square. A bar in Genoa that quietly changed hands and became a meeting place for men from San Luca. Then came the kidnappings. It was a cruel trade, born of desperation but perfected with precision. Wealthy businessmen in the north disappeared from their villas, dragged into waiting vans. For months, sometimes years, they rotted in mountain hideouts, chained like animals in underground bunkers. Families paid ransoms in briefcases full of cash, and with each payment the clans grew richer, bolder, stronger. I remember hearing stories of those hideouts, holes dug in the earth, covered with rocks and brush, deep in the Aspromont. A man could live, or rather survive, in those pits for a year, never seeing the sun. Guards brought food at night, whispers carried down through the trapdoor. Some hostages lost their minds in the darkness. Others emerged broken forever. The ransom money flowed like a river. And rivers carve valleys. With it, the 'Ndrangheta bought bars, restaurants, trucking companies, construction firms. They became invisible landlords of the new Italy. By the 1970s, they were no longer just shepherds and bandits from forgotten villages. They were businessmen, investors, partners, always in the shadows, never in the light. And soon, Italy was not enough. Men from Calabria began turning up in Munich, in Zurich, in Brussels. At first they worked in the factories, shoulder to shoulder with other migrants. But behind the scenes they opened new routes, smuggling cigarettes through Switzerland, laundering ransom money in German banks, buying nightclubs where silence was sold as easily as whiskey. In every city, the pattern was the same. A small group arrived, living humbly, almost invisibly. They sought out paesani, men from the same villages. Slowly they built trust, then businesses. A bar here, a restaurant there. Soon the cash from Calabria flowed in, and with it came power. By the time the world noticed, it was already too late. The mountain clans had woven themselves into the veins of Europe. From the dark soil of Aspromont, their reach now extended to Milan's glass towers, to Turin's factories, to Swiss banks where money lost its name. And still, through it all, one rule remained unbroken: silence. The state thought it was chasing shadows of bandits. It did not realize it was facing the birth of an empire. Chapter 8. The Cocaine Years. By the late 70s, money from kidnappings had swollen the coffers of the clans. But ransom was only a bridge, not a kingdom. To build an empire, they needed something larger, something endless. They found it in white powder. Cocaine. It came first in whispers, carried across the Atlantic from Colombia. At the docks of Joya Toro, crates were unloaded, bananas, coffee, sugar. But inside, hidden in false bottoms, packed in layers of plastic and grease, lay fortunes measured not in thousands, but in millions. The Sicilians had their heroin. The Neapolitans had their cigarettes. But the Calabrians, they seized cocaine like it was destiny. Why? Because they controlled the ports. Joya Toro, built with promises of jobs that never came, became something else entirely. A gateway. A giant mouth swallowing containers from every corner of the globe, spitting them out across Europe. And hidden in that endless flow were the lifelines of the Ndrangheta. I remember the first time I heard an elder speak of it. His voice was almost reverent, like a priest describing a miracle. With 1 kilo of powder, you buy a house. With 10, a street. With 100, you buy silence itself. And buy they did. Judges, policemen, politicians. Men who once ignored them now bowed their heads. The money was too much, too fast, too irresistible. By the 1980s, Calabria's clans were no longer beggars at the table of the Mafia. They were kings of their own feast. Colombians trusted them because they were not fragmented like others. A word given in San Luca was iron. A deal sealed with a Calabrian handshake was safer than a contract signed in Rome. The cocaine years changed everything. New mansions rose on hillsides where goats once grazed. Weddings glittered with gold chains, diamond rings, and motorcades of luxury cars. Sons of shepherds wore Rolexes, their pockets fat with dollars and Deutschmarks. Yet even as they flaunted their wealth, they never lost their roots. In the mountains, old men still ruled, their word final, their silence eternal. But cocaine brought not only wealth, it brought blood. Rivalries deepened. Guns grew louder. Feuds that once killed dozens now claimed hundreds. And every funeral meant another vow of vengeance, another stone placed on the mountain of silence. The world beyond Calabria began to notice. Headlines screamed of drug empires, of shipments worth billions, of violence stretching from Milan to Munich, from Toronto to Melbourne. But still, few understood that all of it, every gram, every euro, every life, flowed back to those same villages hidden among the mountains, where the Virgin of Polsi watched in silence. The kidnapping years had made them rich. The cocaine years made them untouchable. And once they tasted that power, there was no turning back. Chapter 9. The Global Web. By the end of the 20th century, the clans of Calabria had become something more than families. They were no longer bound by the rocky valleys of Aspremont or the narrow streets of San Luca. Their roots had spread across oceans, their branches reaching into cities where few Italians even knew their name. This was not migration. It was multiplication. In Australia, men with surnames echoing the mountains of Calabria controlled nightclubs, trucking companies, and ports. Sydney and Melbourne became echoes of San Luca, places where whispers of vendettas carried on in thick Calabrian dialect, where bullets still answered insults. Even half a world away, blood feuds born in the old country continued, sometimes erupting on suburban streets under neon signs. In Canada, the story was the same. Toronto, Montreal, Hamilton, all carried the marks of the Andrine. They were not outsiders there. They were neighbors, immigrants who worked in construction, in restaurants, in small businesses. Yet behind the counters and the kitchen doors, the same rules applied. Silence, loyalty, blood. Soon, they had their hands in unions, in casinos, in real estate that glittered under the northern lights. In Germany, the spider spun an even tighter web. The migrants who had once arrived as laborers in the factories of Stuttgart and Duisburg had become something else. Pizzerias turned into headquarters. Small villages on the Rhine became outposts of an empire. It was in Germany, in 2007, that the outside world finally caught a glimpse of the depth of the web. 6 men gunned down outside a restaurant in Duisburg, the echo of a feud that had begun decades earlier in San Luca. The blood of Calabria had spilled onto foreign streets, shocking those who thought such violence belonged only in the past. Even in the United States, where the Sicilian Mafia once reigned supreme, Calabrians found their place. In New York and Chicago, they kept their profile low, avoiding the flamboyance of others. But quietly, steadily, they dealt in cocaine, in extortion, in silence. By the time the FBI looked their way, the Calabrians were already shadows, blending into neighborhoods that seemed ordinary, untouchable. This was the genius of the 'Ndrangheta. They did not conquer with noise. They spread with silence. They used family as both weapon and shield. A man in Toronto was not just a restaurateur. He was a cousin to someone in San Luca, a nephew to someone in Melbourne, a godfather to someone in Stuttgart. Bloodlines became lifelines, tying together continents into one invisible net. And through this web flowed cocaine. Tons of it. Ships docked in Rotterdam, in Antwerp, in Hamburg, their containers loaded with South American harvests. And waiting on the other side of customs were Calabrian hands, invisible but steady, guiding the white powder into the veins of Europe. Governments tried to fight them, but how do you fight a shadow? How do you dismantle a family that is not one family, but hundreds, each loyal, each bound, each silent? By the dawn of the new millennium, the world was beginning to realize a hard truth. The Calabrians were no longer guests in foreign lands. They were landlords. And their web, spun from silence and blood, stretched across the globe, unseen but unbreakable. Chapter 10. The Invisible Power. Power does not always march in uniform. Sometimes it whispers in back rooms, hidden behind the smoke of cigars and the rustle of envelopes sliding across a table. By the turn of the new millennium, the 'Ndrangheta had discovered something even more valuable than cocaine. Influence. The kidnappings had given them money. The cocaine had given them wealth. But politics gave them permanence. It began, as always, quietly. A cousin who worked at a town hall. A friend who sat on a municipal board. A brother-in-law who handled construction contracts. Small favors, little deals, nothing that made headlines. But in Calabria, where every road, every bridge, every building was paid for with government money, control of contracts meant control of the future. And the clans learned quickly. Why fight with bullets when you can fight with invoices? Entire towns became their playgrounds. They decided who built the schools, who paved the streets, who lit the lamps. Companies not blessed by the clans went bankrupt. Those chosen prospered. Politicians who cooperated found themselves re-elected. Those who resisted were ruined, or buried. The 'Ndrangheta did not need to sit in parliament to rule Italy. They ruled through shadows. A mayor here, a councilman there, a contractor in the middle. Like strings in a puppet show, each pulled gently, invisibly, until entire cities danced without realizing who played the tune. Even the richest businessmen bent their knees. Construction magnates, shipping tycoons, supermarket kings, all knew that to operate in certain territories, you paid tribute. Sometimes in cash, sometimes in contracts, always in silence. And because they were silent, because they preferred shadows to glory, the Calabrians grew stronger while others fell. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra had declared war on the state, bombing judges, killing generals, shouting their existence in fire and blood. And the state crushed them for it. But the 'Ndrangheta watched, and they learned. They did not declare war. They declared contracts. Where the Sicilians raised rifles, the Calabrians raised invoices. And so, while one mafia burned, the other became invisible. In Rome, whispers spoke of senators who owed their seats to Calabrian money. In Milan, skyscrapers rose on foundations poured by companies with silent partners from San Luca. Even in the Vatican, rumors stirred of donations, of charities, of quiet influence that reached into the heart of the church. The people of Calabria had a saying, "Better a friend in the shadows than an enemy in the light." And the 'Ndrangheta had become the shadow friend of an entire nation. By the early 2000s, they were no longer just criminals. They were the invisible government of Italy. No flag, no anthem, no official title. And yet, they decided which roads were built, which businesses thrived, which men rose to power, and which men disappeared. They had become what every mafia dreamed of but few achieved, untouchable. Chapter 11. Blood and Silence. Wealth changes many things. It builds villas where once there were stone huts. It fills tables with champagne instead of bread and olives. It replaces donkeys with armored cars. But one thing it never changed in Calabria was vengeance. The faida, the blood feud, remained eternal. Even as the clans became billionaires, even as their sons studied in London or Toronto, the old laws still ruled the mountains. Insult must be answered. Betrayal must be punished. Blood must wash blood. I remember stories of weddings where two families, smiling in photographs, were secretly planning each other's deaths. Children who played football together in village squares, not knowing that their fathers had marked one another for execution. In Calabria, time does not erase hatred. It preserves it, like a fly trapped in amber, waiting for the day it will be freed. The 80s and 90s brought wars that painted entire towns in red. San Luca, Plati, Saderno, names that to outsiders meant nothing, but to us were graveyards of memory. Each morning, villagers woke not asking if someone had been killed, but who. Funerals followed funerals. Black-clad widows wept in the streets, their cries echoing off stone walls, while killers prepared their next ambush. Children grew up with gunfire as their lullaby. And through it all, silence. No witness. No testimony. No betrayal of the code. In Calabria, silence was thicker than blood. There was a saying, Meglu nu muort in casa che nu spiru ta porta. Better a corpse in your home than a policeman at your door. And the people lived by it. They buried their sons and said nothing. They wiped blood from their doorsteps and kept their lips sealed. For to speak was death, and worse, it was dishonor. The wars inside the Ndrangheta were not just about drugs or money. They were about pride, about insults whispered decades earlier, about ancient grudges that no wealth could erase. Sometimes a single bullet carried the weight of a century. And yet, as bodies fell, as cemeteries filled, the clans did not collapse. They adapted. When one boss died, another rose. When one family lost sons, cousins stepped in. The blood of Calabria seemed endless, an inheritance of both life and death. It was said that in those years, the soil of Aspremont drank more blood than rain. The state tried to intervene. Police raids, arrests, trials, they came like storms. But storms pass, and the mountains remained. And in the mountains, the code of silence was eternal. The outside world saw billionaires in suits, sipping espresso in Milan, flying first class to Toronto. But inside, in the villages, nothing had changed. The code was still carved in stone. Silence. Loyalty. Blood. And so the paradox of the Ndrangheta revealed itself. They were global bankers of cocaine, invisible rulers of contracts and politics. And yet, at their core, they were still shepherds with knives, ready to slit a throat for a look, a word, a memory. Power had made them kings. But blood and silence kept them Calabrians. Chapter 12. The Modern Hydra. The ancients told stories of a monster that could not be killed. The Hydra of Lerna, with its many heads, cut one, and two more would grow. In the 21st century, Calabria gave the world its own Hydra. The Ndrangheta. By now, it was no longer just a mafia. It was a system, an organism, a network so vast that even governments whispered its name with unease. Europol called it the richest criminal organization in the world. Economists claimed its revenues rivaled those of Fortune 500 companies. But numbers never told the whole story. The true power of the Ndrangheta lay in its invisibility. In the past, power had meant rifles and kidnappings. Today, it meant balance sheets and offshore accounts. A man in Calabria, dressed in jeans and sandals, could sign papers that shifted millions through shell companies in Luxembourg, Panama, Dubai. Cocaine money, laundered through restaurants, construction firms, wind farms, even renewable energy projects meant to save the planet. The Hydra was laughing. In Milan, their money built skyscrapers. In London, it whispered in the ears of bankers. In Zurich, it sat quietly in numbered accounts, untouchable. In cyberspace, it flowed through cryptocurrencies, untraceable streams of digital gold. And yet, beneath this modern skin, the heart of the beast still beat to an ancient rhythm. The clans remained families. Marriages were still arranged to bind bloodlines. Children were baptized not just into the church, but into the code. Oaths were still sworn in candlelit rooms, daggers glinting beside holy images, drops of blood sealing destinies. The Hydra had learned to wear a suit. But its teeth were the same. Governments struck at it again and again. Raids in Germany, megatrials in Calabria, seizures of billions in assets. And yet, for every boss jailed, a cousin stepped forward. For every company seized, another sprouted elsewhere. Because you cannot kill what you cannot see. And the Ndrangheta had mastered the art of being unseen. Even today, in cities across Europe, a pizzeria may be more than a pizzeria. A trucking company may be more than it seems. A cheerful man pouring wine in Toronto may be more than a host. Behind the ordinary, the Hydra breathes. And the world, knowingly or not, keeps feeding it. Every line of cocaine at a party in Paris. Every contract won through a bribe in Rome. Every politician who looks the other way. The Hydra thrives on silence, on complicity, on the illusion that it is not there. But it is. Always. And in the shadows of modern Europe, the Calabrian Hydra has grown so vast, so rich, so deeply entwined in the global system, that one terrifying truth remains. Perhaps it can no longer be destroyed. Only endured. Chapter 13. The Trial of Giants. The courtroom did not look like justice. It looked like war. A hangar, built for aircraft, had been turned into a fortress of law. Rows of iron cages lined the walls, each one packed with men in suits, in tracksuits, in plain shirts, their faces unreadable. Some were bosses. Some were soldiers. Some were accountants, lawyers, politicians. Men who had worn ties in daylight and blood on their hands at night. It was called Renaissance, the rebirth. The largest trial against the Ndrangheta in modern history. Over 300 defendants sat behind bars. More than 900 witnesses were called. Judges presided like priests at a grim ceremony, their robes flowing as cameras flashed. The world watched. For once, the invisible power of Calabria was dragged into the light. No longer whispers in back rooms, but names and faces, family trees of blood and silence exposed for all to see. Prosecutors spoke of billion-dollar empires, of cocaine routes stretching from Colombia to Antwerp, of politicians bought like cattle at market. And yet, in the cages, the accused sat calm. Some laughed. Some whispered prayers. Some simply stared ahead, their silence louder than the speeches of lawyers. They knew that in Calabria, trials end, but the code endures. One journalist wrote, "It feels like trying to put the sea on trial. Because how do you cage a hydra? How do you sentence a shadow?" Months passed. Sentences were read. Hundreds were convicted, many to decades behind bars. Headlines shouted, "A blow against the Mafia." But in Calabria, the villages did not change. The villas still stood. The money still flowed. The Hydra, wounded, slipped back into the dark. The trial was historic, yes. But history, in Calabria, is long. Longer than prisons. Longer than governments. The men in cages knew it. The prosecutors knew it. Even the judges knew it. This was not the end. It was merely another chapter. Epilogue. The man with the tattoos. The fire crackled low. The old man leaned back, his arms bare, tattoos fading into the wrinkled map of his skin. Symbols inked in youth, when blood was hot and the world was small. He had told the story, his story, their story, Calabria's story. Of shepherds turned into kings. Of boys who became soldiers. Of silence heavier than stone, of blood older than memory. Of how a handful of villages grew into an empire that stretched across oceans. The young ones who listened sat silent now. Not out of fear but of awe. The old man took a slow breath. His voice was rough, but steady. People think the Mafia is about power. About money. About fear. They are wrong. The Mafia is about memory. About never forgetting who you are, even when the world changes around you. That is why it survives. That is why it always will. He tapped his chest, where under the tattoos, under the scars, His heart still beat to the rhythm of Calabria. You can fight it, you can jail it, you can call it a monster, a hydra. But remember this: monsters die. Families don't. The room was quiet. Only the fire spoke, the flames licking the wood like tongues of history. Outside, the mountains of Calabria stood dark against the sky. Ancient, silent, eternal. And somewhere, in the shadow of those mountains, the story continued. Because in Calabria, stories never end.